Hi, everybody. This is my reaction to my first time reading through Austen's well-known and beloved classic, Pride and Prejudice. While I am familiar with the characters and the general plotline due to references to them and their influences on other works, I haven't seen any of the film adaptations either. This video covers Volume 2, Chapters 16 through 19, which is the end of Volume 2. Dun, dun, dun. So, while I am going to try to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, there is a significant plot event that happens later in the story that I am aware of, and that plot event is being set up in these chapters. I don't think it's being strongly foreshadowed, so I'm pretty sure the reader isn't supposed to expect it to happen. I think Austen wants it to come as a shock to the reader, but she's a capable enough writer that she doesn't want it to come out of nowhere, so she's laying some groundwork for it ahead of time. However, since I know about this particular significant event, it has very much shaped my reading of these chapters, so just keep that in mind. So, Chapter 16. First of all, I'm confused. The author mentions that the three young ladies are heading back home, finally, which makes me think it's Jane and Elizabeth and Maria, that's Charlotte's sister. However, they meet up with Kitty and Lydia in the dining room of an inn where they're going to be picked up by Mr. Bennet's carriage for the drive home. And then Maria is just completely dropped. Like, there's a whole conversation and they have what I guess maybe is lunch and then head on to the Bennet home. But it does mention that the Lucases come by to meet Maria and visit with the Bennets. So I guess maybe she just didn't say anything and got ignored. Maybe it's because her name is Maria. I guess Maria is the Mary of her family. Anyway, back at the inn, Lydia has ordered food and says that she and Kitty are going to treat the others to this meal, except that the older sisters need to loan their younger sisters the money for the treat because they spent theirs on new hats from the milliner across the street. Lydia says she doesn't actually like hers, but she figured, quote, I might as well buy it as not, and says she is going to take it apart when they get home and see if she can't restyle it better herself. Right. Lydia is really the central character in this chapter. She talks a lot and she is thoughtlessly selfish and unkind. We are obviously not supposed to like her. And apparently we're supposed to believe that their mother's giddiness and their father's complacency has simply allowed her to grow up this way because she hasn't had any direct guidance otherwise. Never mind that Jane and Elizabeth have exactly the same parents who had less experience in their cases. But the thing is, the sort of behavior that Lydia is demonstrating in this chapter actually does hurt people. And there is no way that you grow up with siblings without that resulting in squabbles. I can definitely imagine that as the youngest of the 5 children, Lydia learned to act out in order to get attention. But if as parents you just always let that happen, you end up with catastrophe way before 15 years go by. And also, if there's anything Elizabeth should feel ashamed of, it is not her own attitude toward Mary King, which, while superficial, is not such a big deal as she seems to make of it in this chapter, but her own treatment of Mary, her sister. And Jane isn't actually blameless for once. Although disdaining traditionally feminine frivolity, Mary seems to be an early version of the girl who is not like other girls. Mary clearly longs for the respect or at least approval of the people she cares about. Instead, everybody ignores her, or at best merely tolerates her. And Elizabeth and Jane are just as guilty of that as their parents are. Mary Bennet deserved so much better than she got from this family, or from this author. And at some point, maybe over the summer, I'm going to see if I can't find some spin-off novels that feature her. Who knows? Maybe I'll fic it. Probably not, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. Is she contemporaneous to Holmes? Maybe she could team up with Enola. That would be an interesting read. Anyway, apparently the regiment of soldiers that has been in Meryton is going to be moved from the town that they live near to Brighton for the summer. Kitty and Lydia and Mrs. Bennet have been pushing Mr. Bennet to take the entire family to Brighton, but Elizabeth figures out that although he hasn't shut down the plan completely, That's just because he enjoys stringing them along, and he has already made up his mind that they are not going. Elizabeth is relieved to think that she won't have to worry about Mr. Wickham, and he'll just be out of the picture entirely. Chapter 17. Somehow, Elizabeth manages to wait until the next morning to tell Jane about getting that awful proposal from Mr. Darcy. I find this completely ridiculous. She has been so itching to unload about this to Jane that how is it that the least bit fathomable that they didn't have a whispered late-night conversation after everybody else was asleep? Anyway, whatever. Accept it and move on, I guess. Jane is at first surprised, but then is like, well, yes, you're awesome. Of course he proposed. Because A, St. Jane, duh, and B, she is kind of besties with Elizabeth, so maybe she's a little bit biased. Anyway, for whatever reason, they both express sympathy for poor Mr. Darcy and his hurt feelings because Elizabeth turned him down. Never mind that she never, ever gave him the slightest encouragement at all. I guess maybe they can rationalize it away that it would have been quite advantageous financially, and maybe he figured her for the practical sort. Whatever. Maybe I'm just a soulless viper, but I think they're giving entirely too much weight to Mr. Darcy's delicate sensibilities. So, Elizabeth then moves on to the news about Mr. Wickham. And poor Jane, who doesn't ever want to believe anything bad about anybody, goes through these intense mental acrobatics, trying to figure out a way that both Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham can be good people who just oopsied, followed by anguished shock when she accepts that she can't make that work. Anyway, they both decide to believe Mr. Darcy's account, but Elizabeth isn't sure what to do about what she now believes about Mr. Wickham. Jane thinks it'd be better not to reveal his misdeeds, and Elizabeth joins in, noting that Mr. Darcy didn't want the news about his sister getting around, and that she doesn't really actually have any evidence at all. And nobody's likely to believe it just on her say-so, given how well liked Mr. Wickham is. Plus, the regiment's leaving next week, so it really won't even matter. Jane agrees even more heartily at that, pointing out that maybe Mr. Wickham is sorry about what he did and is trying to make amends, and it would just be unkind to ruin all of that. Oh, Jane. Jane, by the way, still has feelings for Mr. Bingley, but she's trying to get over him. Their mother tells Elizabeth that she is convinced that Jane will die of a broken heart, and then he'll be sorry. Elizabeth, for whatever reason, is not as willing to use her wit against her mother as she was against Lady Catherine, and just kind of waits that out. Mrs. Bennet then proceeds to start speculating about Charlotte and Mr. Collins, and how savvy Charlotte is, and how they will never have to worry about money, and they're probably eyeing the house the Bennets live in, which Mr. Collins will inherit, remember, already. So, I guess last chapter was a reminder not to like Lydia, and this chapter has been a reminder to not like Mrs. Bennet. Ugh. Chapter 18. The regiment is leaving at the end of the week. Quote, all the young ladies in the neighborhood were drooping apace. All that is, except for Jane and Mary, who don't seem bothered, and Elizabeth, who is incredibly relieved. However, Lydia is abruptly in rapture when she receives an invitation to go along. The colonel in charge of the regiment had recently gotten married to someone who is not a whole lot older than Lydia is, and she and Lydia met when the regiment arrived in Meryton and quickly became besties. Kitty, however, is of course miserable in comparison because she is being left out, and she's 2 whole years older than Lydia. Life is so unfair. Elizabeth is also upset, though for different reasons. She talks to her father about her concerns, and apparently they are that Lydia will make a fool of herself and make the family look bad. Yeah, that's what she's worried about, even after reading and supposedly believing the letter from Mr. Darcy, in which he accused Mr. Wickham of trying to RUNNOFT with his little sister Georgiana. The little bit of wiggle room that I'm willing to give her is that she's pulling from her own recent experience where Mr. Darcy tells her that he didn't want to propose to her, and he'd also convinced Mr. Bingley that Jane wasn't interested in him, and in addition to that, he'd avoided telling Mr. Bingley that Jane was also in London. Since she has just recently experienced how their prospects have been affected by the improper behavior of other members of the family, it's understandable that this experience is in the forefront of her mind. Additionally, upon reflection, Mr. Wickham did have a personal grudge against Mr. Darcy, and there isn't anything like that with any of the Bennet family. Now, one of the other draws for him with Georgiana Darcy was that marrying her would mean a lot of money. Lydia has no such attraction to offer. Elizabeth might believe that this means Lydia will be safe from Mr. Wickham's attention. But there's no reason for that, given that he'd previously been focused on her, despite the fact that she didn't have much either. We are told that Lydia is imagining she will be the center of attention and will be adored by everybody. And that if she knew that Elizabeth was going to try to prevent her from going, she would be super upset. It's kind of more the same. And then Elizabeth finds out that now that Mr. Wickham has been ditched by Miss King and her £10,000, that she is once again the object of his attention. She's a little insulted by his apparent assumption that after he ditched her for Miss King, that once he got ditched himself, Elizabeth would just be flattered to have him come crawling back. The day before the regiment leaves, the officers are all dining at Longbourn, Elizabeth's house, and Mr. Wickham asks Elizabeth about her trip to visit Charlotte and Mr. Collins. Well, Elizabeth is apparently feeling extra petty because she mentions that Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy spent 3 weeks in the vicinity. Mr. Wickham goes a little pale at this, but recovers quickly and asks if Mr. Darcy has better manners, snipping that he doubts, quote, that he has improved in essentials. And Elizabeth gets in a nice bit of feigned innocence with, oh, no. In essentials, I believe he is very much what he ever was, and adds that she likes him better now because she's gotten to understand him better. Wickham at this point is nervous enough and savvy enough to edge away from Elizabeth for the rest of the evening, which is probably exactly what she wanted. However, he makes sure to maintain his charming demeanor. At the end of the evening, Lydia joins Colonel and Mrs. Forster when they return to Meryton so that she can go along the next morning when the regiment leaves. Her departure is, quote, rather noisy than pathetic, mostly because Lydia herself is, like, squealing with excitement, although Mrs. Bennet makes sure to encourage her to, quote, enjoy herself as much as possible, and our narrator makes sure to tell us that Lydia is definitely going to follow her mother's wishes in that. And there is no reference to Mary in this chapter at all. Chapter 19. Okay, so we start the chapter off badly with an examination of the Bennet's marriage, which is pretty much Mr. Bennet married Mrs. Bennet because she was pretty and then found out that she was irredeemably stupid. I have problems with that on just so many levels. First of all, the idea that people don't change. Can't change. Like, no. Just no. Full stop. And then he just totally gives up on her and on any possibility of being happy with his marriage and family. Fortunately, he likes books, so they're able to live well within their means, but he regularly provokes and insults his wife for his own amusement, and we're supposed to find it funny because she's too stupid to figure out what he's doing. What a jerk. We are told that Elizabeth has always been aware of her father's failings, but because of her respect for his abilities. What abilities? His ability to enjoy the comfort of a life without work? His ability to humiliate his wife? His ability to just ignore his family? I don't know. And because she's glad he's nice to her, yay, self-interest. She just lets all that crap just slide. Plus, in her defense, it's not supposed to be a child's responsibility to provide guidance to a freaking parent. But whatever. Mr. Bennet is a jerk, and I am much more sympathetic to Mrs. Bennet than Austen intends. Mrs. Bennet has become exactly what her parents, her associates, and society in general has taught her that she ought to be. She is the feminine counterpart to Gaston, my thematically favorite Disney villain, though he lacks the delicious panache of my actual favorite, Dr. Facilier. So next is a long paragraph about Elizabeth being bored. Oh, she's looking forward to going to the lakes, although it's just her and Jane hasn't been invited. Lydia is writing to her mother and to Kitty occasionally, and her letters are brief, and of course talk about the officers, and she's always buying stuff. I can't imagine that Kitty particularly enjoys getting these letters, given that she didn't get to go. But as spring moves into summer and social events start picking up again, Kitty's mood improves, and Elizabeth begins to think that maybe she's not as hopelessly stupid as Lydia and their mother. Yay. I'm so glad we have such a relatable protagonist. Anyway, Elizabeth gets a letter from her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, who says that Mr. Gardiner's business means they can't leave as soon as they'd wanted to and will have to be back earlier than they'd hoped. So the Lakes is out, and instead they're going to Derbyshire for 3 weeks. As it happens, this is not only an area Mrs. Gardiner is familiar with, as she spent, quote, some years of her life in that county, but it's also where Mr. Darcy's estate is. Elizabeth is, quote, excessively disappointed, according to Austen, but I think she handles it pretty well and tries to be as positive as she can about not getting to do something she'd really been looking forward to. So anyway, we fast forward past the next month, and then Elizabeth leaves with the Gardiners for Derbyshire. Interesting side note. The Gardiners have 4 kids, 2 girls, 2 boys, all under 10. They're going to stay at Longbourn, kind of in exchange for Elizabeth. Jane has agreed to look after them, but I'm kind of curious how that's going to work out and how the rest of the family will respond. Not that we'll find out, but whatever. So literally on the way to Derbyshire, they go through some interesting places that are not described, and I guess they spend some time exploring those. I don't know. I have exactly zero idea how long they're spending in travel or where they're actually going to end up staying. Anyway, on the way, they so coincidentally happen to be passing not far from Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's estate. And Mrs. Gardiner says she'd like to see it again and asks Elizabeth what she thinks. Elizabeth is immediately as stupid as the plot requires, unable to say something as simple as, I really have no interest at all, Aunt, but if you very much want to go, I should make no objection. For your sake. In fairness, she does make some attempt to express that she'd rather not, but it's weakly done, and her aunt navigates around it easily. Again, plot. When Elizabeth goes to bed, she asks the chambermaid about Pemberley, and particularly whether the family is currently staying there. She's very relieved to find out that nobody's home, as that means she won't have to worry about running into Mr. Darcy. However, this doesn't at all help me understand why that would make it okay for them to show up uninvited when the owners aren't around. So the next day, they're off to somebody else's house without an invitation. Yay? I guess all I can do is just accept that this was apparently considered perfectly acceptable in that society. It makes no sense whatsoever to me. But thank God, that is the end of the chapter and the end of volume 2. I'm going to get through this, but I'm tired of putting up with Elizabeth. Mr. Darcy sucks. Characterization gets fudged for the convenience of plot and clever narrative barbs. I realize this is supposed to be social critique, but I am so done making excuses. Internal consistency and effective characterization are high priorities for me, and they don't seem to be for Austen. I may have to at some point go back to Elizabeth Gaskell's novel North and South and see if Fanny Thornton is treated with as much neglect and derision as Mary Bennet, and even more so Mrs. Bennet herself, who is never even given a first name. I hereby dub her Cordelia in honor of both the name Anne Shirley always wished she had, as well as the equally poorly written Cordelia Chase. I will not forgive you, Joss Whedon. I'm really upset about this, you guys. She did everything that she was supposed to. She was pretty and charming, and she married above her station. She had 5 children. And they were all daughters. And the estate is entailed. I have put some Mary Bennett spin-off novels on my TBR for this summer, but I think what I really want to read is a prequel AU called The Courtship of Cordelia Bennett. It should be set, say, 5 years after the birth of Lydia, the youngest. That would make Jane 12, still definitely too young to come out. Mrs. Bennet has begun trying to instruct Jane and Elizabeth in how to attract the attention of potential husbands. Because if their father dies before at least one of her daughters secures a husband wealthy enough and kind enough to take care of all of the rest of them, they will be reduced to nothing. And she has no support from her husband, who alternately ignores and insults her. She is as shallow and pragmatic and short-sighted as Austen suggests, but no, she's not stupid. She knows how desperate the situation is. And I think she knows that the man she married does not love her. And she is so completely alone. I really want to read a story in which he realizes that he's underestimated her, and they work together to help each other become better versions of themselves. If you know of anything like that, please, I beg you, link that sucker down in the comments. Until next time, bye for now, everybody.